It's a similar philosophy, and that is a key thing where if I were to tell young artists one thing, I would say you have to commit to the lifestyle, because the lifestyle is one where you build your life on speculation.
Welcome to the Flying Fruit Bowl, a platform dedicated to the discussion and exploration of art and the creative process. I'm your host, Aaron S., and this week's episode is the second part of a two-part conversation. If you haven't heard part one yet, please listen to last week's episode, and this part is a direct continuation of the conversation. Thank you very much. As well as painting onto canvases and panels, Anna has dabbled in and still creates both textile and public art.
The biggest chunk of your income goes towards where you live and why there's so many homeless people.
Yeah.
We can't afford to keep a roof over our heads anymore. So get out of debt. That's the way to do it. So moving to Chattanooga and looking at, leaving the country and coming to the city and looking at how the development in the city, because I came to Chattanooga 10 years ago, right before the big expansion that's happening now. So I've actually been witnessing this development expansion and seeing how we struggle with keeping the beauty of the nature around us with the needs of urban expansion. And that's where the urban series came from, was the observation of that coming from a country life into a city life again. And I saw it in Atlanta, hated it when I was there, but had to live there because of my business. Loved it in the country, but in all honesty, it became boring after a while because there just wasn't enough to do. So I chose Chattanooga specifically for the size. It's only so big. This city can only get so big. It cannot geographically become another Atlanta. Atlanta can gobble up the entire state of Georgia, which is what it's going to do at some point. Because Atlanta is now the city that decides the elections of the state of Georgia, because it's grown so big. It's fascinating to me to watch that kind of push-pull that goes on. So the urban grids were born out of, first of all, Atlanta's a city that has a lot of squirrely roads that, there's not a grid anywhere in the place. It's just squirrely roads all over the place, cow paths that were paved over. Chattanooga, the city, is actually a very grid. And Sarasota, the town I grew up in Florida, was also a very grid city. Very easy to get around in. I mean, and we have, all you have to do is find out where Lookout Mountain is, and where south is. So, it's very easy to navigate both geographically and the way they've set up the city. And I became fascinated about city life and city streets, and how there were sections of Chattanooga that had erosion had taken its, this was a big manufacturing town, and then it was abandoned. Manufacturing moved out of the city and moved to other parts of the country and out into the country in Tennessee. And so you had all of these areas of Chattanooga that were just dead. I mean, they were just, all of these manufacturing plants that were just eroding into the ground. So there was this wonderful erosion of these buildings and, metal and rusty metal and all this stuff, all this visual texture going on in these parts of these undeveloped parts. And I was fascinated by that. And so when I first moved here, I went around with my camera, my Nikon D40, which my Apple smartphone takes better photos than it does now, which is so funny. But I went around with my Nikon and I took all these photographs of erosion and so forth. And so I have this library of imagery that I can pull from. And then I take city maps and I look at the street structure, and that's where the grids came from, was a bird's eye view of city streets that, you get a tornado, you get flash flooding, you get earthquakes, you have hurricanes, you have all of these natural disasters come in and wipe out what we build. And we have to rebuild them again. So the maintenance, this push-pull of humanity against nature is what interests me in my work now. And it was sparked by my mother getting dementia.
Oh.
I looked at the erosion of my mother's mind, and it fascinated me. It appalled me, and it fascinated me at the same time, because I watched this dramatic change when it really got its teeth in her. She became someone I didn't know anymore, and then it was really weird because she didn't know me anymore. And I can't imagine a worse fate for someone, especially an intellectual, to lose their mind like that. To dementia. And there are periods of lucidity when you're losing your mind to dementia or Alzheimer's, until you get to the point where you just don't know anymore. But that period where what's happening to you is really, because I had conversations with my mother when she was lucid, and she knew what was happening. And so going through that with her, I started thinking about the erosion of the mind, and I started looking around my studio, because I was still doing the figurative abstract work at that time, but starting to see the collector base shrinking for that work. And then I was needing to do something else. And part of the process was to build up layers of color and then sand them down. So it was abstract. It was additive and subtractive to get those rich layers of color and texture that I would build the figure around in that sort of almost cubist manner, like the stained glass windows we talked about earlier, and saturated color. And so I started looking at these sandpaper fragments from my sandpaper blocks. And one of my favorite things to do was to sand into paint that was still slightly wet, kind of tacky. And it would do something to the surface that engaged me in such a way that I could elaborate on. And I would toss the sandpaper aside. And in the beginning, I was tossing them out. And then I started looking at these sandpaper fragments going, these are really beautiful, because they were collecting colors of paint in a random way that I wasn't paying attention to at all, and embedding themselves into that rough surface and drawing on the surface and becoming part of that surface. And I thought, this is really interesting. What can I do with these? So I started cutting them up into strips.
Oh.
And that's where the weavings came from.
Yeah.
They started out as sandpaper weavings. And so I'm like, well, what can I do with these? So I just started playing with them. I was like, okay, let's put it. They started out as kind of overlapping collages. And then I said, well, that's not quite enough. Let's cut them even into thinner strips and kind of weave them together and make these sections. And then I was like, wow, I could make these little weavings from these. And then, but if I don't glue them together, they're not going to stay together very well.
Yeah.
So what can I do? And then I actually, one of the other things that happened when I moved to Chattanooga was I discovered book arts. And so there's a book arts page on my website. And that really was kind of a culmination of the early graphic design days, where we had to physically put brochures and things together. So it was a natural for me to take to book arts and then learn the various different types of binding. And one of my favorite binding methods was Coptic binding, which is an ancient method. All the early religious texts were put together by the monks through Coptic binding. So it has a long history. And the stitching and discovering Irish linen waxed thread, which is what you use in bookbinding, it's really strong. So I started punching holes all along the warp and weft of these sandpaper pieces, and I started stitching them together. And it was this process of one hobby leading to another part and coming back and informing my art practice in different ways. So I really encourage artists to try different media just to see what it does. It makes you think about your work in different ways. It forces you to look at different ways of putting materials together, that it doesn't always have to be about paint going on canvas or panel. It doesn't always have to be about sculpture from a block of wood or clay. There's so many different ways of putting media together today, so many creative ways of doing it, that just about anybody who has any interest in any type of media can become an artist, just from observing the way different elements go together and what works best. So then the weavings kind of grew, and I just saw them as an offshoot, just kind of a thing I did for myself. I didn't see them really as marketable. And again, it was just something I wanted to do for myself, which I do a lot of. I do a lot of stuff in my studio in my off time where it's just for me. I don't care about collectors. I don't care if it's sellability. I don't care about finding a market for it. I do it for the love of it. And that's what keeps me going back to the regular practice that does keep the roof over my head, because I still have to pay property taxes.
Yeah.
No, I own my own house. I still have to pay taxes.
Yeah.
And I still have to put food in my mouth and pay utilities and all of that. So it's easier when you don't have mortgage or rent looming over your head, like the sword of Damocles,
Yeah.
Because it can be that oppressive and that daunting when you choose the lifestyle of an artist. But I do say that not only was it based on me not having any real interest in anything else when I took that aptitude test all those years ago, but also just a compulsion and an obsession to create something with my hands.
That's absolutely fascinating, because there's what I love actually the most is there's a lot of experimentation there, and there's a lot of just kind of trusting yourself with creating things that it may work out, it may not. Like your weavings, for example, that's such a great way that you discovered them, because as you said, they weren't anything for you, they weren't anything for you to be selling, they weren't anything, they were just for you, just to kind of enjoy. And it's I like the idea of you should always have one thing that you do in your life that does not make you money, you do just because you enjoy. Because the problem is that everything nowadays is about money, everything's about making money, and it's not everything is about money. Money is very important, but everything's not about money. And I think money very much quickly can kill off creativity. So I think you have to have at least one thing you do in your entire life that is not about money, that you do just for joy and the pleasure of being able to. Because creating art is a luxury for most people. And I think we often forget the fact that you can even create anything, no matter what it is often a luxury. Not everyone has that ability to be able to do that.
That's true. We are a luxury item. That is a great way to put it. And luxury items are not necessary on the surface to society. But the more you delve into society, one of my science credits in college was anthropology. And I decided on it because, I wanted to learn a little bit more about evolution. I was immersed in religion growing up through the Catholic Church. Let's flip the coin and look at the other side, right? And let's look at evolution. Let's look at how we came about. Let's look at the history of the planet and the history of people. Believe it or not, the name of my professor was Professor Tongue, which I still laugh about that today, because he was just so dry and such a horrible teacher. I'm amazed that I got anything out of it, but I'm glad I took it, because it really made me look at evolution in respect to the evolution, not only of humans and the environment, but the creative evolution of an artist, or how you get into it and how your evolution is natural. and how it's needed, because any species that doesn't evolve will cease to exist.
Sure.
So if you look at your art practice like that, you can really have an advantage, because you can say, look, that was why I paid attention to my collector base diminishing from the figurative work. What was selling? How can I create abstraction that I'm still happy about making? And what's going to bring me a new collector base? Because essentially, that's what an artist has to keep doing. You have to keep building new collector bases, because they always change.
Of course.
And if you're not, every generation of collectors are interested in different types of art. And so you follow that path and you pay attention to it and you reinvent yourself, or you will not survive as an artist. You'll become a has-been artist. You'll have that one period where you're the golden artist in the sun, and then nothing.
True. That's very true. So that's a good way to look at it, actually. And also, I really liked your earlier, your kind of breakdown of like the different kind of generations and like how their lifestyles really kind of, they almost dictate what kind of art they can and can't buy. Because I think we'll get to a point like in maybe 50 years, say, depending on the society, like where people just won't, may not even be able to buy art outright, but just because it'll either be too exclusive or no one will have the money. I think it will probably go that way, unfortunately. So there's a kind of good consideration. But one thing I wanted to touch upon is your public art as well, because I think this is really interesting about the idea of, because I think a lot for, unless you're like, quote unquote, I don't know if people like the term, but unless you're a street artist, quote unquote, or an environmental artist, not a lot of artists get the opportunity to have their work actually exhibited outside or displayed outside on a large scale. So like, I'm kind of really curious, like, where did the public art come into play and how did you kind of find these opportunities? And kind of like what work did you present?
Yeah, it's a whole another realm in the art world that a lot of artists don't even consider.
Hmm.
It's one of the reasons why I chose Chattanooga. When I was thinking about leaving Blue Ridge, Georgia, I knew I wanted to stay kind of in this region because I've lived here all my life and I know it. And I don't agree with the politics of the South, but that's a whole nother discussion. So I had it honed down to two choices, and I was looking at Asheville, North Carolina, and Chattanooga, Tennessee. And when I looked at Asheville, when I looked at the cost of 10 years ago, when I looked at the cost of living from Asheville versus Chattanooga, it was dramatically different. Asheville was way more expensive. And so I said, okay, I can't afford to buy a house, because I knew I wanted to pay cash for a house.
Yeah.
So I started looking at what was available then and what the prices were. And I said, I can't afford Asheville, and I could afford Chattanooga, because it was before the boom that happened here, or that's going on now. And the other reason why I chose Chattanooga and what sparked my interest, because when I just Googled Chattanooga, I was like, what is it? And I'd come up here for the Four Bridges Arts Festival. A neighbor of mine had been, and she dragged me up here and I said, oh, I actually really like this city. I like the way it's laid out. I like everything about it, blah, blah, blah. And then when I just was Googling it just to get an idea of where this was, I was thinking about moving to, what kept popping up was public art. And it was like, the city of Chattanooga actually made a department within the city called Public Art Chattanooga.
Wow.
And they devote 1%. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it ends up being a pretty fair amount of all the property taxes that are collected in Chattanooga and the surrounding area goes to Public Art Chattanooga. They made a commitment as a city to do that.
That's really cool, actually. That's really cool.
So that was another reason I said, never thought about public art before. And here were all these articles popping up about public art. And I said, okay. So I started researching that more. And I was really excited with what I saw in the public art realm before I moved here. So that actually was like the final decision making element of moving here, was their devotion to public art. So I actually it was interesting. I bought into a neighborhood here called Highland Park. And at the time, it was pretty dicey neighborhood. It's an inner city neighborhood. It had the crack epidemic of the 90s really hit this neighborhood hard. Everybody moved out. All the white people moved out to the suburbs. It was largely a people of color neighborhood. Not very good incomes, but the original homes were these big homes that were Highland Park was the original suburb of Chattanooga, and it was based of the Great Flood of 1889 that flooded the Tennessee River flooded the entire downtown. And so people were like, okay, now we need to move outside of the city. And it was called Highland Park because you actually go up a hill to get to it. So when I moved here, I actually kind of got involved in the neighborhood association. I met another artist, a local artist by the name of Kevin Bate. And at that time, he was working on getting a grant to do a mural project on Macaulay Avenue, which is just like 2 blocks over. And he approached me about being one of the artists involved in this Macaulay Arts mural project. And so I said, well, sure, why not? So we had a designated amount of money that each of us had, and it was enough for me to do. And we got together as a group and we went up and down he had approached the businesses with the buildings that would allow us to paint on their buildings. And so we had several buildings to choose from. And so we all choose the walls we wanted to paint and began that process. And that's what introduced me to public art in a more practical sense. And I started pursuing public art on my own. And after that, you have to get adept at grant writing. You have to really understand how to put a grant application together. And it is a whole nother world, let me tell you. And you have to follow it to the letter. Because if you do one thing wrong on that application, it kicks you out. So it is that simple and that devastating. So you have to really pay attention. You have to really devise a project that really works within the parameters of that grant. So you have to really pay attention, and there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through to get accepted. So for some reason, maybe because of my marketing background, again, which has helped me all along in my career, I was able to learn that very easily and do it, because I also wrote copy when I was a designer as well. So I did a lot of that as well. So I have all these skills that the average artist doesn't have, that have been brought over into my art practice. So, you have to be able to either live in a city that designates public art as part of their environment, or you have to be able or willing to go wherever public art projects are available. And it might mean traveling to another city to produce a public art piece, and then you get into travel expenses and living expenses away from your home. So there's some limitations to public art. And, if you happen to live like in LA or New York, or Miami, any of the big cities, they have very healthy public art stuff going on. Look for cities close to you that would be an easy commute that might have public art projects if you're interested in getting into it. One thing I will is a cautionary tale to public art. Kind of the last thing I'll say about it is you don't get paid very much for the amount of work you put into it. It is a labor of love, and it's something. But the one thing I will say is it not only helps you learn how to navigate through a very governmental system through the grant applications, but it also engages you with the public and the neighborhoods that you're creating art for, because a lot of the research you do for your project, you have to engage that neighborhood. So you learn about where you live and you learn about the people who live there, and that's really rewarding. And then you also are paid to create a piece of art that's accessible to everybody.
Yeah.
And that is the main attraction to public art.
Yeah, because I was going to say, if you don't get paid much, fair enough. But like the fact that your work is going to be viewed in a context that is completely different from how people normally view your work is actually a really extraordinary good opportunity, because not everybody gets to have their work presented like that. And the kind of feedback you'll get will be like actual real world, real life feedback, not oh we like it, it's cool, heart eye emoji. It's actual feedback that you actually want to hear from people. And I think, and it adds to the actual landscape of where you live. It's not just, oh, it's here today, it'll be gone tomorrow. It's like this is going to stick around. Yeah, it will. And also, what's nice about public art, I think, from my perspective, is that it weathers with the environment. It becomes the environment itself, and I like that. There's something really nice about like it's the city you live in. It becomes the city you live in, and I like that. There's something nice about that. But do you think there should be more accessibility for artists to create public art?
Absolutely. I think that any city that engages in a lively public art system and creates it and makes it actually part of their city government, it actually promotes, in one way it's good, in one way it's bad. It promotes development. It gets developers interested in your area. So it's something that can actually bring economic. There's been a lot of studies done on dilapidated areas of cities that have been targets of public art, and it brings prosperity to that area. So not only is it uplifting in that it gives artists another forum in which to produce, and it gives you that rewarding, that satisfaction of having very accessible art and participating in it and beautifying where you live, but it also brings economic prosperity to areas. And they do credit Public Art Chattanooga as part of the development craze here, as well as, well, we did something in our city that was pretty amazing. We're called Gig City because Chattanooga was the first city in the United States to embed a fiber optic network into the power grid.
Oh.
They got a federal government grant to pay for part of it. The city kicked in millions, tens of millions of dollars, and then the local energy company, EPB, kicked in. Everybody kicked in this equal amount of money from 3 different sources, and they embedded the fiber optics into the power grid. We have some of the fastest internet in the world in our city, in this little town of Chattanooga, which is actually we're a mid-sized town. So downtown is 160,000, but the Chattanooga area is 500,000. That's not small change. It's a mid-sized city. So we started getting all these write-ups in the New York Times and Forbes magazine, and that's what all of a sudden we got all these startup companies which were leaving the tech industry in California and coming to because it's a lot cheaper to live. There's no state income tax in Tennessee, so that's an additive. And there's a lot of business incentive taxes that draws business to this area. So it's been kind of this nexus point of bringing a lot of different elements together. It's turned us into a boom town. I'm harassed by people that want to buy my house. And I could no longer afford to buy a house for cash in Chattanooga.
Wow.
10 years.
That's
so
impressive.
It turned out to be a great investment. I mean, my friends who knew me from Atlanta, when they told, they could understand why I moved to Blue Ridge to be around beauty, to hone my art. They could not understand why I moved to Chattanooga. They were like, "You're moving where?" And now they're eating their words because they realize what a good investment I made by coming here. But the arts play a big part of that. A lot of artists move to Chattanooga because of the lively art scene. We're still not a sophisticated collector market here, but a lot of artists live here. I don't sell well in Chattanooga. I sell well other places. All my galleries are elsewhere. So
interesting.
Yeah. So I ship my work everywhere.
Yeah. So geography is interesting, actually. The point you raised, like the fact that you live in a city that isn't a place in which you can sell your work well. And I think like, how important do you think it is for an artist to think about their location, or like where they're based?
Again, it goes back to that question, what is it that you want?
Hmm.
One thing I will say is if you're willing to live in a place like Miami or Los Angeles or New York, if you can stomach that level of intensity in terms of a city, and of course, in your case, it would probably be London,
Yeah.
Or Glasgow, or wherever you are in the world, or Beijing in China. If you're willing to live in a major urban environment, the advantage is that you will have probably a more sophisticated art market than you do in smaller towns. And so your opportunities for showing and exhibitions and gaining notoriety are going to be bigger. So the other thing that's kind of emerged, and another thing that drove the substrate on which I work now, is shipping costs. So that's something you have to consider if you do want to live in a smaller town and you do get in to selling venues that are far away from where you live, where you can't really drive to them and deliver artwork in a reasonable amount of time, if they're cross country or another part of the world or so on. You have to think about shipping expenses.
Yeah.
And the pandemic changed the world with shipping, because not only did it produce scarcity in a lot of ways, and then we saw inflation take off as a manifestation of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Also, FedEx and UPS, at least in our country, I don't know what entities you have elsewhere, they quit taking oversized packages because they were overwhelmed by the isolation of everybody due to the pandemic and having to order so much stuff online. So they were overwhelmed by the amount of business they couldn't keep up with it. So they did a size limitation, which meant if you do large artwork, like I do large abstracts, it means you had to go to freight shipping.
Oh.
I don't know if you've ever priced shipping with freight. It
No,
is
but I imagine that's not going to be cheap.
astronomical. It's astronomical in price. I mean, one piece, like a recent, I actually had an actual large sale off of Instagram last year, which surprised the heck out of me. And I looked at freight. I was given for a single piece, a 40 by 60 panel in a freight was $1,500.
That's insane. That's
It was
absolutely insane.
From Chattanooga, Tennessee to Rutherford, New Jersey.
It's not even out of the country.
Which is just west of New York.
Like that's not even out of the country. That's insane.
Now, it's on the same coast, for Pete's sake.
That's insane.
It was a pretty, and I actually laughed at the guy. I laughed. So I just said,
what else can you do?
I'm sorry. I just couldn't compute that. So of course I didn't do that. So I actually ended up, for that particular piece, I went to what is called a white glove service, which, believe it or not, was cheaper than everybody else, which I was shocked. And these are art transport companies, and there's a few of them now in the United States. I don't know if there's any in the UK, where it's like a fleet of vans, and each of these vans is outfitted to transport a certain type of art, whether it's paintings, two-dimensional work or three-dimensional work. And they have a schedule. So you contact them and you give them your information, where they would be picking up the piece of artwork and where they'd be transporting it to. And they put you on a delivery schedule. If your client is willing to do that, it took 3 weeks for them to come and work us into the schedule and come pick up the piece. And you minimally pack it, because it's not being tossed around like it does with UPS or FedEx. So it was a basic wrapping with cardboard on the front, glassine paper, small bubble wrap, cardboard on the front, corner protectors, and that was it.
Oh,
And it was ready for pickup. And so they showed up when they said they were going to show up. They pulled right up into my driveway. They came in, they looked over the piece, made sure it fit their insurance requirements for the packaging level. And it did. And he picked it up and took it out to his van and went up to Rutherford, New Jersey, along his path with his other deliveries. And it was delivered within 4 days.
wow. That's cool.
And it cost just over $500. And
Wow.
I split it with the client
Hmm.
because she bought it directly from my studio. So that was the discount she got, was me splitting the shipping with her. So
Yeah.
these are nuts and bolts things that artists have to think about with their career. Do you want to live in a place where you want to sell your work? Do you want to? Personally, I wouldn't want to live in LA. I'm sorry. And it's where the art scene has moved in the United States. LA is the big city now. New York is waning. Chicago's been gone for a long time. Miami is still okay, but Art Basel Miami still does pretty well down there, but that's about it. And so everything is LA focused. And I think that has to do with Pacific Rim and China entering the art scene. So proximity. But yes, proximity is important for artists to think about. You have to think about shipping. Are you going to get in galleries? So what I did based on this astronomical shipping fees that started happening from the pandemic is I said, okay, my galleries still want large pieces. So what I did was I said, okay, I'm going to try painting on canvas. I've never liked canvas because I don't like working on stretch canvas because it moves. And I like a hard surface, especially with collage, and especially because I put so much material on it. I had to think about that. So I use heavy duty cotton canvas. Linen will not take what I do. It'll just sag in areas if you don't. You need a really strong substrate for collage, and that's primary focus of my work is collage mixed with paint. And then so I said, okay, I'm just going to buy it in rolls. So I bought a big ass roll of canvas, and I happened to have some working panels hanging around the studio because I'd done a large weaving commission. And it was a transport panel for this giant weaving that I did. And we had to rent a truck to get this thing because it went into a local hotel. And it was 6 feet by 11 feet. And I've never done a weaving that big. And it was an amazing project. It was insane. But it took up my entire studio work because I have a smallish studio. So I had to build a panel wall to build this thing against out of plywood with a back frame. And so I had all these panels left over. So I had these working panels. I said, I'm just going to cut them to the size I want to do them. And I'm going to sort of kind of stretch them onto these panels and staple them down. And that's how I'm going to work on this work. And I finish the work and I top coat it. I release it from the panel and I roll it up and I stick it in a tube and I ship it to the galleries. For about, depending on I usually do about an 8-inch diameter outer tube with a 5-inch diameter inner tube that you wrap the canvases. And you can get 4 or 5 big pieces into one tube and ship them across the country. And it costs you maybe $300 rolled up in a tube. And then there's the stretching fee on the other end. It depends on the gallery. Sometimes the gallery will front the cost on it. I have 2 galleries that'll do that. And then they add that cost to the retail price and they keep it when they sell it. Other galleries ask me to pay for the stretching fee, and that's fine. I'm fine with that because it's minimal. And then I have a gallery that splits the cost with me. And then we just split the 50-50 commission, no problem. It's added to the price, and then we just split it. And so there are clever ways, and this was my way of dealing with the changes in the shipping industry and the scarcity of the pandemic and what was going on. And so not only do I no longer, because construction trade boomed in the pandemic, everybody decided to work. I couldn't afford panels anymore from my carpenter.
Oh, the price. So I work my full-time job. I work in retail, but I work in a hardware store, and I cook things on a timber saw for people. So the price of wood has gone up, has doubled in the last year, easily. So I know, like, in terms of like construction and just in terms of like wood and stuff like that, it's astronomical at the minute, and it's only going up as well.
I know. And so when you look at the cost of an unstretched roll of canvas, I can get a 72-inch by 10-yard roll of canvas of heavy duty cotton. I mean, this is like a 20-ounce per square inch gauge on this stuff. It's heavy. And when I get those rolls, I have to drag them in the house
Yeah.
because it's so heavy. But I can get 4 to 5 bigger pieces out of one roll for just over $200.
Mm.
Then a couple $100 to ship it and a couple $100 to stretch it, 150 to stretch it. When you look at panel costs and you look at shipping costs of those panels and you look at it's like a fraction of what I was paying before. So that's why I switched to that. And these are things that this is what I find fascinating about being an artist is it's all about determination to be flexible, because artists have to develop flexibility for these very reasons. All of a sudden, we're faced with a pandemic. How are we going to sell our artwork? How are we going to get it to our galleries? How did this change me from working on panel to canvas for that very reason? And usually I used to hate canvas for that reason. I just don't like my substrate moving on me. I like to have a solid surface I'm working on.
But it's interesting to see how resourceful you are, though. Like, it's not just you didn't just sit there and be like, oh, well, this is annoying. You actually made changes that actually has helped you.
Well, yeah, and I think that's the beauty of creativity is it's all about adaptability. I mean, and that's how species survive, is this learning of anthropology and learning about evolution. That was a key element to my education that I've applied to my art practice. How do I survive as an artist? What are the changes that I need to make? Pay attention, be motivated to make the changes you need to make to survive, because if you don't, everything's going to go away. And you're right about your statement earlier about the future of art. We have a finite period of time that two-dimensional art is going to be sought out.
And I think we're already seeing that shift really, I think, in many ways, with the whole NFT kind of like boom, rise, whatever you want to call it, trend. Right. I don't know. But I think it's kind of got a lot of artists worried, but I think also it's kind of generated a lot of intrigue in the arts as well. I think it hasn't all been that bad. Like, it's not something that I'm still aware of. It's not something I put a lot of time or effort or energy into looking at, rightly or wrongly. But one thing I do understand or do appreciate the fact that people are thinking about art a lot more now than they were, like, say, 2 years ago.
That's true. I mean, I looked into NFTs because I started getting harassed on Instagram about people.
I think that's why people who don't want to do NFTs, because they're getting harassed.
NFT, right? And I was like, what the heck is an NFT? I didn't even know what it was, until I started popping up, and then I looked into it and actually talked about it in another art talk I did, another Zoom art talk, and I was like, so in the United States, and I don't know if this is global, but NFTs are bought through cryptocurrency and not actual cash. So, first of all, in the United States, cryptocurrency is illegal.
Is it?
What I find fascinating is not only it's weird. It's this illegal currency that's not regulated in any way. It's not backed in any way. There's no guarantee. That's why it keeps crashing. Why cryptocurrency crashes all the time. There's nothing backing it. And at the same side of it, there are some retailers that accept cryptocurrency, like Home Depot. I was shocked.
Really? That's
that
weird.
Home Depot accepts cryptocurrency. I was like, you're kidding me.
That's bizarre that anywhere that's a physical establishment would accept cryptocurrency. That wouldn't, well, as far as I know, I might be wrong, but that does not happen in the UK. Like, that's just not something that happens. I've never known anywhere to accept that.
I was shocked. Believe me, when I started doing the research on it, I was shocked. I said, well, there's very few retailers that will take the cryptocurrency, but they're starting, and it's like any other switch in technology, it's market driven. So at some point, cryptocurrency is going to be more and more accepted by retailers, and that's what's going to push them to create laws in the United States that accept it and regulate it, and then it'll be taxed and all this other stuff. So, it's inevitable that cryptocurrency will be in the future. And in fact, it might be the future of commerce, might be all cryptocurrency. I have no idea. We could be heading in that direction. But I think that part of, you have to think about, like, what is the dwelling of the future going to look like? And will my artwork fit into that dwelling of the future? Now, I think it'll be beyond my lifetime because I'm already in my early 60s. And so I think by the time we get to the point where people quit buying two-dimensional work, I'll probably be dead. And so, I'm not that worried about it. If I was a young artist today, yeah, I would definitely be worried about it. And I would think about, well, how can I follow the trends and how can I start creating work? And I would get into the digital sphere of creating art. If you're worried about it, do it. Do it in your spare time. Be adaptable. Follow the stasis of evolution, and get ahead of it, because there are several artists I follow on Instagram that are doing the NFTs. They don't like it. They're kind of doing it grudgingly. There are others who love it, like photographers, because their work already exists in a digital realm. Because they're mostly digital artists, there's very few film photographers left in the world. And so it's a natural for them to get into NFTs, not so much for physical artists. Now, I have to say that for me, I love my work in Photoshop. I love designing my pieces in Photoshop. I love working out compositional issues. Sometimes I'll even do a preliminary sketch in Photoshop, and then I start the piece in reality, and it's not working in the physical sense how it was looking in Photoshop. And so I paint myself into a corner, and what I'll do is I'll photograph it in its current state, and then I'll take it back into Photoshop and I'll play with it. And that gives me the freedom to just do whatever the heck I want with it, because I'm not ruining the surface or trying to do something to the surface that's hopefully something wonderful is going to happen. I can take it back into a digital realm and I can play around with it, and then it gives me a direction to go in. So I find this to be a huge advantage in the studio.
So what I love about that is that this whole idea of like construction and reconstruction and deconstruction in your work, which is like the very much kind of parallels the idea of the cities, which the work derives from. And that's kind of very, very interesting, because like your work is very much you going back and forth between what you want to add, what you want to take away, what should remain, what should be, kept. And I like that. And that's really nice. It's a nice parallel. Is that deliberate?
Absolutely. I mean, the process is driven by my thesis, which is about, the erosion of city-states through natural disaster. And then the fact that we have to constantly maintain these cities in order to keep them alive and working. California in particular has a lot of issues in terms of, wildfires are prevalent. Now there's flash floods, and, they're in a very precarious situation, and they've had a long time drought out there that is like, now they're getting drowned. So it's like these extremes. And that's what they warn about in the future with climate changes and global warming, is that, everything's going to be more extreme. What I've found about where I live and thinking about geography is that we're kind of in a sweet spot where we're at in the country, because by the time hurricanes hit the East Coast or the Gulf and come north, they're dissipated by the time they get to us. And so we don't have the hurricane worry that the coastlines do. That'll change in the future once the current coastlines disappear and are underwater. So the new coastline, so everything's going to shrink. Everyone's going to be moving inland. Everyone's going to be going north to a point, and then they're going to be living on the southern what do they call it down there? Antarctica, because there's an actual landmass there that could actually be built out and lived upon. So the Antarctic is going to be a population of the future. And the North Pole can't be lived on because it's all ice. And once it melts off, it's gone. So, there are countries that are already starting to lay claim to parts of the Antarctica.
That's weird. But I think also what's really interesting for me is because obviously here in the UK, we don't have natural disasters in the same way. Like it's obviously we have none of that. It's not where we even have to think about. And only until you mention it, I'm like, that's so strange that, of course, for somewhere like any part of America, or at least some parts of America, like the idea of construction is constant because you're always rebuilding, because things are always happening. Here, like in London, London's always just being rebuilt anyway, and construction around the UK is always prevalent, but it's not for the same reasons, which is really interesting, actually.
Yeah, you have rain or no rain over there. That's pretty much snow or no snow.
Yeah, absolutely.
I went to England back in 1997. I went on a trip and flew into London and then went up to York and then Bath, kind of did that triangle.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Good triangle there.
Yeah, so it was really interesting to see the contrast between those three places. Loved public transportation, got a train, bus pass or a train pass where, I could go between the cities. It was wonderful. It was great public transportation. But I do remember having conversations because I've always loved everything British, and I love British humor, and I love British murder mysteries, and I've always been a Monty Python fan. And so, the whole thing is British humor appeals to me a lot. And so I remember having conversations with people, and they were like, "Oh yeah, you live over there with all that big weather." That's what they call it.
Big weather.
What you guys call it, the big weather. All that big, and it's true. It's massive. And you just look at the scale of those hurricanes, it's terrifying.
It's insane.
And growing up in South Florida, it was very part of our environment, whether we were going to constantly have this sort of Damocles over us. This is that hurricane going to curl around into the Gulf and hit the west coast of Florida. So it was that constant worry. So yeah, I think that geography informs. I know that a lot of artists that I follow in the Northwest, most of their art is based on Northwest environment, trees and mountains and that kind of thing. So I know that depending on where you live, and I think it should reflect on the work that you do. Unless you're going into the more academic side, like we talked about earlier, is it about a big idea or is it about your environment? So mine is derived from the city in which I live, and then I've morphed it into this urban series that has a lot of different offshoots, which I find very useful because different galleries want different things.
Yeah.
So I would encourage artists, if you're looking to get into the gallery circuit, which is still alive and well, by the way. In fact, they've seen a boon in growth since the pandemic. Plus, there was also, when the event industry collapsed and art fairs suffered, everything was just shut down. Galleries, but there was, even prior to the pandemic, the top end collector base was getting tired of the art fairs. They were looking for a more intimate relationship that brick and mortar galleries provide, more catering to their specific needs, rather than going to the art mall, which is what, So I think that the stress is because they were starting to see there was too many art fairs, not enough collectors to go around. It really became a tourist attraction. The art fairs, all these tourists were showing up. Those mobs you see at all those art fairs, they're not all collectors, they're tourists. Okay. So there was this false impression that the art fairs were getting all these gobs of collectors, and that was not the case. The real collectors, the ones that were actually buying the art, come on the VIP nights when it's not open to the public, and they go in and they make their selections, pay their money and leave, and then all the public comes and the tourists, and they go around to look at art. Yeah. So there was this false impression about art fairs. And so the pandemic shut all that down. And then also the need for the fact that the art fairs were starting to put galleries out of business was, those two, they were supposed to work, it was all about intention. The reason they were set up to where to be in an art fair, you had to have a brick and mortar gallery in order to get in, is because they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to put galleries out of business, but inadvertently they did anyway, because all the collectors wanted to go to the art fairs initially, before the art fair fatigue happened. And so they couldn't afford to ship massive amounts of art to these art fairs, pay exorbitant, because I mean, those booths like at Basel start at 50 grand.
That's insane. That's
So for a
insane.
small gallery or a mid-sized gallery, they couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford to do both the art fairs and keep a brick and mortar space. So they ended up shooting themselves in the foot.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I went to the other art fair in London probably about just under 2 weeks ago. And it was a great experience, but the amount of money that one booth costs is a lot of money for people who may not have that kind of money. And it's such a huge gamble as an artist. If you're going to go as an artist for your individual self, it's a huge gamble. But as like a business, like whereas in like that money you could be profiting by opening more shows. Like that's a huge gamble. That's a huge risk.
And since it's always in flux, the art market is always in flux. That's another reason why you have to commit to the lifestyle, is it's always in flux. There is no sure anything, because I could remember having conversations pre-pandemic. Everyone's saying, "Was Anna, why are you still in galleries? They're going the way of the dinosaur." And I said, "Yeah, well, it's all going to change again." And then now I think the key thing is, the key word that I'm hearing is immersive art. And why Yayoi Kusama became so popular with her infinity rooms, because people would walk into this environment and experience this infinity room. I saw her at the High Museum in Atlanta. I made the trek down there for her exhibit. And it was, the selfie moment of photographing yourself inside of this space and being in this immersive environment. And I do think that the art of the future will be some sort of digital projection that's on the walls and everywhere within a room of a dwelling. I think that's where art's going to go in the future. So whatever you do, so in a way, as an artist, you get public art and you start thinking about the space in which you're creating might be a really good way for you to think about NFTs and immersive art, artwork. We're not there yet in terms of, still the high-end collectors, because the galleries I'm in, like I'm in Dallas, there's a lot of money floating around in Texas. I'm in Palm Desert, California, which is like big palatial homes, and these are people that have 10 or 15 of these massive homes, all this concentrated wealth. And Charleston, South Carolina has proven to be a really good location for me, because it's a coastal city and there's a lot of old generational money there, as well as it's still a resort town. And so a lot of expensive tourism happens there, and they want to buy art when they're there. So that turned out to be a good market for me. And then Asheville, not so much, because it's still more of a craft base, collector base. So if you do more craft related artwork, you'd probably do better there than I do. And I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, which, my sister city, and it's still not that great of a market. So the spreading yourself around in different markets, if you want to stay in the gallery circuit. I use Instagram, like I said earlier, simply to notify my galleries and my collectors of my process and where I'm at with work I'm working on for them. But I will also say that the posts I've done where I've listed the sales of pieces very discreetly has actually brought galleries to me saying, we can tell that you're a selling artist and we want you in our gallery. So if you view it as a tool and as a means of keeping in touch with your collector base, your galleries, or whatever, look at it that way. Set up a schedule like you and I do. Set up, your post text in notes or whatever type of thing you've got. Cut and paste, drop it in, get it done. It's just something you do on a regular basis. And it's you're good to go, and it's just another part of your toolbox. Really, don't look at it like, I'm going to go waste all this time on it, because you just can't do your art and sell your art at the same time, full time. You can't. You've got to find these platforms and individuals that do it for you, and be a part of it. And so diversify. Get into, if you see the future of NFTs, get into the NFTs. I'm waiting for cryptocurrency to become legalized before I'll get into it. And once, but one of the things I do is when I do a painting in my studio, or a collage painting mix that I think is a more exceptional piece than the normal pieces, I haul it over to my local place and have a high resolution scan of it made. So I have that digital, high-end digital image of it that I can sell in future. So I'm thinking about NFTs. Knowing, so I'm creating a library of my best work with high resolution scans, and this entity charges $50 for a basic scan, so it's not that much. So it's worth it. And I don't have them do any color correction or anything, because I have my Photoshop skills. I just get the raw image from them, take it into Photoshop, do all the color correction, do the cropping, and so forth. And I have those skills. And if you don't have those skills, get them.
I was going to say, you're very skilled in a lot of different areas that I feel like a lot of artists aren't. I think there's one thing that I think a lot of artists kind of almost forget, or like that maybe they shouldn't think about, is that like you have to have skills beyond just painting or just beyond creating art. You have to have the computer skills. You have to have the computer literacy. You have to be able to use Photoshop. You have to be able to use, video editing software. You have to be able to use Instagram Reels. You have to be able to use, like Word, and writing grants and writing scripts and writing different things. So you have to have all of these different skills. What has been like the most surprising skill that you've either learned or you've had to learn being an artist?
I don't know that there's any one in particular. Although what would stand out immediately to roll off of my tongue here would be knowing Photoshop inside and out. And having been on it for 30 years, back in its infancy when it was terrible, it was before Adobe bought it and really transformed it into a really good application program, that I would say my skill with Photoshop has enabled me, because not only can I do my preliminary sketches in it, not only can I document my work really well, and there are cases where every piece I do, whether, it's an exceptional one that I'm having a scan made of, the normal pieces, I take segmented photos. And what I mean by that is I photograph different segments of it. And then I take those segments and I put them together in Photoshop, and I end up with a much bigger file. It's still not on the level of a scan, but if you can't afford to have scans made, that's one way as an artist that you can get larger files, is to take segmented photographs and then put them together learn Photoshop by all means. And plus two, in the States, I don't know what it's like in the UK, you can write off your monthly fee for leasing the program on your taxes. So it gives you another write-off to do. So these are all things you have to think about as an artist. You have to think about marketing. You have to think about photography. Fortunately, I used to style photography when I was in advertising, so I know how to style photography. I know how to that is probably my marketing background is the single most important thing that has surprised me in how much I use it today. Photoshop being the one thing that stands out the most. Take some night courses in marketing, take some night courses, online courses of how to use Photoshop. Lease it, because that way you always have the up-to-date version of Photoshop and all the tricks and services you can do. If you just do Photoshop and Lightroom, it's $10 a month.
Yeah.
That's affordable, and make that part of your practice. And, if you aren't skilled at writing and you know someone who is, barter with them to write your artist statement to help you with it. Give them an outline of what you do and have them put together a really good artist statement. So seek out your tribe in what you need to make yourself successful as an artist. Get on as many platforms as you can. Utilize them as a tool, not as a time suck, which is what a lot of them can be. Actually set a physical timer on your phone. Say, okay, I'm going to go on Instagram for 40 minutes, and that's it. And when that goes off, you get off the platform. So if you develop these skills, and if you really stick to it, it will not only make you a lot happier, make you more successful as an artist, it'll give you more time in the studio to do what you love, which is create. And so think of it all as a tool.
So I have a question for you from the last artist I interviewed, an artist called Emily Wallerstein from LA, very interestingly. And her question for you is, when you've established an identity as an artist, how do you handle the process of trying something new, and how do you consider your audience?
I think in a way we've already kind of, talked about that earlier, roundabout. And so, just to be more concise, I would say, for me, it was actually the change in the collector base that made me change what I was doing anyway, reinventing myself, I call it. So it was natural to just create an evolutionary process. But if you're actually wanting to grow and you're starting to get a little bit bored with what you're doing, another thing I always recommend with artists is create, a series of different series. So you can group different ways that you approach your work in very distinct series that's separated but yet connected with through who you are as an artist. And each of those series can give you or allow you space to expand upon and grow and evolve as an artist. And then otherwise, if you kind of are already doing that, just create work for yourself where you evolve and you change. Yeah. And there are artists that even actually create pseudonyms.
Of course.
And, and so that's another way you can approach it. And you can actually have, I know one artist that has 5 different pseudonyms that creates very different,
oh, wow.
completely different work under completely different names with completely different collector bases.
Wow.
And they love it and they thrive on it that way. So there are ways. I did it briefly. In fact, I did it when I made the big switch from abstract figurative to the abstraction I'm doing now. In the urban series, I created a pseudonym and I approached it that way for that very reason. I was worried about my collector base, what I had left of it from the diminishing sales, and created this new identity and started into them. What I found was it grew so rapidly that I just dropped the pseudonym and put my actual name to it, and it was fine. Yeah. So that would be my recommendation, either or of those.
That's actually they're really good suggestions. Do you have a question you'd like me to ask the next person I interview?
I actually wrote something down here. Let me see if I can find it. Because we've talked so much about different things. Yes. If you could describe your work with one word, what would it be? So it's actually a dual question. One word, if you could describe it, what would it be? And this makes you really dive into and brainstorm about what you're doing to nullify down to a single word. What would it be? And where do you want to go with it?
Oh, that's actually a great question.
So that was what I came up with.
See, that's also interesting because I have an idea of who I'm going to interview next. So I will send you their work just so you have an idea who they are. Um, Somebody from the UK, very interestingly. And I think actually he'll find that question very interesting, actually. Um,
Okay.
so thank you very much. That's a great question. So,
Okay.
what does it mean to be a successful artist? And how do you measure the success of your own work?
Yeah, that's the question of the ages, right? I mean, depends on, are you in a capitalistic society like we are, right?
Sure.
So in a capitalistic society, a successful artist is one that makes a lot of money. It's like Damien Hirst, right?
Yeah.
Or Jeff Koons, as being right up there. Do you want to fake your own death and try to get your art to skyrocket, reemerge as a pseudonym? There's that.
Oh,
Right? Could that create a successful artist? Now, I would say, to answer it from a holistic point of view, I would say how to measure success as an artist is if you're actually producing what you love and what you're satisfied with. Are you satisfied at the end of the day
hmm.
with what you're creating? I consider that success. And I have this really deep-seated belief that if you create what you love, you will find a market for it.
Hmm. Yeah.
Because you'll be passionate about it. It'll show up in the work. If you're creating work you hate, people will subconsciously pick up on it. If
Yeah.
you're creating work just for a specific market, it's going to show up in the work. Develop your own style, be happy with what you do, be satisfied at the end of the day, and create the work you love, and you'll find the market for it. You will. And you can go out into the world with that work 100% behind it. And when you're 100% behind it, you will generate excitement about it. When you generate excitement about it, the money will follow.
That's really good advice, actually. That's very good advice. So, what would your younger self think about your work?
That I'm mad as a hatter. Yeah, because when I was young, it was all more about survival. It was about, I grew up in a very abusive childhood. I had a very abusive childhood,
Oh,
and I grew up in it with a lot of turmoil and not enough money, too many kids, parents divorced. So I mean, I really feel the
oh
pain
yeah.
of people who, and they divorced when I was 12, so it was a really bad time. Adolescence is a really tough anyway,
Yeah.
let alone with your family disintegration. I in fact embraced it because I figured anything new would be better than what was there.
Yeah.
So I didn't have a good family structure to start with. I didn't have a good foundation. So it was all about survival. But what was interesting is that I also had illnesses when I was a kid. So you created, it's almost like you're born with an old soul when you're sick as a kid. Because it forces you to, if you're constantly living with pain of some kind or another, depending on what it's debilitating. It affects who you are. It affects how you observe the world. But it also, what it does is it turns you into a keen observer. So not only was I sick a lot, but I was also living in an abusive environment. So you developed these observation skills because you looked for all the physical triggers that was going to set off an abusive episode. So because of these observation skills, I think it's what informed me to become an artist later in my life.
Oh, wow.
But at the time, it was all about survival. So I
Yeah.
would have thought more about, because I grew up in a blue collar family. I mean, my father worked for an automotive company and my mother was a nurse. And so it was very practical, necessary. So I envisioned myself going into nursing like my mother.
Hmm.
I had no idea I'd be an artist back then.
That's so interesting, though, how, as you said at the top of this interview, that your past informs your future, like it very much did. And I think that's really, really fascinating, actually. That's really, really interesting. It's just very interesting. Just kind of your whole journey is extremely interesting. And the last question for you, should be glad to hear. What are you currently working on, and where can people find more about you and your work?
Well, I'm currently working on what I've come to realize within all these series in the urban series that I've been doing, the botanicals, the grids, the urban collages. What's actually gaining in popularity, when I first started doing the series, the urban series, the urban botanicals were the best-selling ones. And so it was like, okay, well, inevitably I'm going to end up doing more of those because they're what's selling. And so I need to keep a roof over my head. So I concentrated on it. But I did these other offshoots, and the grids have gained some ground to the point where, because people love the concept of embedding an urban grid into a piece, and I've actually gotten commissions from people
That's cool.
that want where they live embedded into the commission.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because it's universal.
Because it's universal, it can be anywhere. And of course, I do a disclaimer on the contract I do with them that, I'm going to destroy a lot of that grid in the process. It's not going to be an exact replica of where you live, but the energy of it will be in there. And so they agree to that, or it doesn't happen. But what's really gaining ground, and I've been a little bit, in a way I'm surprised and in a way I'm not, are the urban collages. And I think it's like what we just talked about, my love of paper from my graphic design days of being into print media, and my love of Photoshop and creating stuff and printing it out and collaging it into my work is the excitement of it. And what I love, that's where I gravitate to. And that excitement is generating in the work, and it's starting to gain more ground. So it's a lesson learned, try things based on where your interests lie as an artist, and the market will follow. So, that's been really interesting. And so that's where the concentration is now, and that's where I want to go with it.
That's absolutely amazing. And where can people find more about you and your work?
Well, probably the most active. I mean, I don't update my website as much. And in fact, you can't even find it if you do a Google search, but it's annacarll.com. And that's ANNACARLL, 2 L's, don't leave out the second L.com. And Anna Carll Art on Instagram. And that's how you can keep up with me posting about progress and so forth. So those two entities are where I'm at. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm going to drop Saatchi art because it's just gotten too big, and I've never made a single sale off of Saatchi.
But that's actually where I originally found your work.
Really? I know.
Yeah. So what a lot of people don't know is that, like, I look at Instagram a lot for art, but one of the best places for me to find new artists to feature or interview is Saatchi Art. I'm part of their newsletter, so every other week they send, not me specifically, but they send out their newsletters. And I always look through them to look at who's being featured and what kind of art they're looking at. And then I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And I'm like, oh, this person's interesting. So that's how I actually found a lot of people for the Flying Fruit Bowl website to feature, because I look at Saatchi Art a lot. Like Saatchi Art, Behance, and Instagram. So I don't look at TikTok. I'm not on TikTok. I don't pay attention to TikTok. So somewhere like Saatchi Art, because for me, that name, it means something. So for me, that's why I'm always like curious. And it's always, and something like Saatchi Art, I'm curious to see who follows who as well. The easiest way for me to find cool artists is to find out who comments and follows another artist's work. That's the best place to look for artists, in my opinion, that I've found so far.
So maybe I should not drop Saatchi.
I would advise you not to drop it. I'd say, keep it, even if you don't use it, just keep it as a profile somewhere, because someone's going to come across it at some point. And you have to remember, even if it's like a dead webpage that you don't use, someone's still looking at it, it still has reaching ability. Even if you don't make a sale off it, that's cool. You don't need to necessarily, but definitely keep it online, because people will be looking at that. I most certainly looked at that. It's actually where I got most of your bio from before I went onto your website, which is interesting because I looked for you. Obviously, I Googled your name, saw your Saatchi, looked at the Saatchi page, and then I Googled your name again to find your website. So
because my SEO is terrible. So
it was bizarre, and I was like, oh, that's weird. But then so I would advise you absolutely keep your Saatchi profile, and actually I'd advise any artist who hasn't got one to get one, just for the exposure, the potential exposure, because also it's a big name, and also you don't know who's going to be looking at that.
That's true. And I know it originated at Saatchi Gallery in UK, right?
Yeah, over here in London, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Which is why I'm like, and over here in London, it's not prestigious exactly, but it's still the name holds meaning for people.
It's a bedrock name, yeah.
Yeah, of course. So
in the art industry.
Yeah,
so.
I recommend, if people ask me where to publish their work, I recommend that to a lot of artists. I'm like, publish it here because it means something. Yeah,
even though a conglomerate owns it now.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. Like I think, the politics of obviously just websites generally and money making is different. But I would highly still advise you. I'd highly advise you keep your profile just for the exposure on anything else.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good, because I did get a message from them. You haven't been to your page in a while. You better do something, or we're going to drop you, or something.
I don't like that, because for me, like, the internet should be an archive. Like the way I look at everything I do for the Flying Fruit Ball is an archive. Like it doesn't matter about how many views I get today. It matters about who gets to see it in the future, and is then inspired or affected by that.
Yeah, and I have not updated it in a long time, and I really should. So well, that's good advice. So I think I will do that. And that's on my list of things to do then. but I'm on LinkedIn, which I don't know if you know LinkedIn at all.
Yeah.
So,
of course I know.
And I think I'm trying to think of all of them. Have you ever heard of Activate?
No.
So that's another platform that's been hammering at me. I don't know. I might look into that. But anyway, really my website and Instagram are going to be the most active, and I guess Saatchi, so anyway.
Thank you, Anna, so much for your time.
Oh, Aaron, thank you. It's been delightful. You're great to talk to, easy to talk to, and
that concludes the second and final part of my conversation with Anna Carll. Thank you very much for listening. Any questions or comments about it, please send me an email over at theflyingfruitbowl@gmail.com, or get in touch on social media sites such as Instagram and Twitter. The Flying Fruit Bowl podcast is available on a variety of sites such as Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube. If you like the show, please consider rating, reviewing, sharing, or subscribing on any of these platforms to help spread the word. Also, please don't forget to check out theflyingfruitbowl.co.uk for daily art inspiration. And if you're a creative, please get in touch for a chance to be featured or interviewed. If you'd like to support the platform further, we now also have a Patreon page. To hear start for more about, and more information can be found over at patreon.co.uk/theflyingfruitbowl. Additionally, if monthly donations are not your thing, we also have a PayPal for one-time donations. I'll include a link to our PayPal in our show notes. Once again, thank you very much for listening to the episode today. Until next time, folks, please stay safe.